I am a Filipina, which means a woman who is a national of the Philippines. But many years ago, I don't know if you monitor this, the Oxford Dictionary came out with a definition of a Filipina, and it means domestic worker. And of course, the government, the Filipino people were outraged. But every now and then after that, we would encounter similar situations, and we don't know if we will have to be angry all the time. So probably this would explain why. We have like, they can
No, put the thing. Oh,
what? What is happening? Okay, so, all right. Okay, and probably the explanation why they're coming up with all sorts of definitions for Filipino is because we have like 10% of our population overseas. We are scattered in 238 countries around the globe, and this is the configuration. And every year, we have about 1 million Filipinos going to these different places. As you can see, the trend is ever increasing, despite with the crisis, without the crisis, is always going up in terms of people leaving the country. Proportion of women, the red bar is the women, and you would notice that in 2007 it went down a little bit, and that was because that was the first year of implementation of a new policy reform specifically to address protection for our domestic workers. But after 2007, you will note that again the proportion of women has increased, and later in the later slides you will find out probably why. In terms of deployment of domestic workers, while we see that, well, there's nothing wrong with women going abroad if they cannot find job opportunities in the country. But what is sad in a way is a lot of our women migrant workers are concentrated in domestic work. And as we have heard from across the globe, domestic work is one of the most vulnerable jobs locally and also, of course, overseas. And these are the top countries of destination. From among these top 10 countries, one, Kuwait, UAE, Saudi, Qatar, Oman, and Bahrain are all in the Middle East. And their situation are much more difficult compared to the others that are also in very difficult circumstances, of course. In terms of gender, and this is why I'm saying that a big majority of our women are concentrated in domestic work. You can see from the graph that it's really a runaway winner in terms of the job categories for our women. Of course, this is the most visible benefit of labor migration, the remittances that we send to the families back home. And specifically for the migrant domestic workers, this is the contribution. So it's not like very negligible. It's a lot, and it is consistent. That's the other thing that we can say about migrant domestic workers. We've heard about their stories, so how are they responding to their situation? Policy level in 2006, that was in the aftermath of the Lebanon War, the government of the Philippines implemented this policy for domestic workers. They're using a different name, by the way, household service workers. It's kind of complicated and confusing. But anyhow, it says in the package of reform that a woman who is to be deployed as a domestic worker should not be paying placement fees, should have an entry-level salary of $400, must be 23 years old and above, because they said if you're older, you're more mature and probably you are a little bit safer, especially in the Middle East. But that has not really no scientific basis. Pre-qualification screening of migrant workers in terms of the skills. Then there is culture and language orientation, and there is on-site verification of the employers, the foreign employers. Our question with the government is this really effective? Have there been any impact assessment of this policy reform since it was implemented in 2007? And to date, there's none. And that's why we wanted the government to do an impact assessment. The other law that was significant into 2010 was the amendment of the Magna Carta for migrant workers. And these are the salient provisions of the law. So again, the whole thing is protection, strengthening protection specifically for the most vulnerable, who are the domestic workers. But again, the whole question is, how is government in terms of implementation? The other significant policy reform in 2010 is the Magna Carta of Women, where it provides for the deployment of a gender focal point officer in countries with just concentration of women migrants. It's supposed to start deployment last December. But again, we have to check with government because we will have laws, but then in terms of appropriation, they usually would have to be a different question. And unlike in New York, after more than 10 years, we have yet to have our own national domestic workers law. So on-site, overseas, Filipinos, together with other migrant nationalities in Hong Kong, have to struggle with many different issues, one of which, or top of which probably, is the discriminatory policy, which is specifically against migrant domestic workers. This is the new conditions of stay in Hong Kong. And this was brought by to the CEDAW committee in 2006 during the reporting of China to the CEDAW. They are also engaged in trade union organizing. The Alliance of Progressive Labor is a trade union in the Philippines, and it has extended its work in Hong Kong to organize the Filipino domestic workers. They do a lot of meetings and capacity building, and one of these pictures is a baking session in Hong Kong. And in 2003, Congress also passed the overseas absentee voting to enable the Filipinos overseas to participate in Philippine elections. And this was the first exercise in 2004. As you can see, it was an inspiring image in Hong Kong. But that was like the first and the last time that we've seen this long queue. Key runaways, this is like one way to look at it. This is problematic area, but I think in the case of the Middle East, running away from very abusive employer is a way to defend your right. And this is the shelter in Saudi Arabia, in Jeddah and in Riyadh, where a lot of these distressed migrants are staying, awaiting the repatriation. This is a group in Spain that is primarily working with Filipino domestic workers, and they were given citations and commendations by both the Philippine government and the Spanish government. And of course, as a member also of the Migrant Forum in Asia, we are engaged in the lobby for the adoption of an ILO Convention for Domestic Workers, and this is one of the consultations we've had in the Philippines. This is a good opportunity for the migrant domestic workers advocates and the local domestic workers advocates, together with the trade union, to work very closely with the government of the Philippines. We have had big and little steps that we have undertaken, but we need to create enabling social, cultural, and legal environment. We need to utilize and maximize bilateral, regional mechanisms for dialogue and negotiations, even as we try to lobby for an ILO convention for domestic workers. We need to have viable alternatives to migration back home, because otherwise policies will be there, but then the migrant workers will not be using them or asserting and claiming them unless things are in their favor or in better situation. So briefly, that's it. Thank you.